The night had fallen heavy over Willow Creek, a quiet town that lived by the rhythm of the railroad whistle and the ringing of the church bell on Sundays. The rain had been falling since sunset, beating down on the dusty main street until it turned to mud. Sheriff Daniel Harlow stood on the edge of the station platform, his wide-brimmed hat dripping with water, his coat soaked through. He had been called out by the station master, who said a young woman had been found sitting alone on the last bench, waiting for someone who never arrived. At first, Daniel thought it might be some mistake, perhaps a passenger left behind or a traveler stranded by the storm. But when his eyes found her in the dim light of the lanterns, he felt something stir inside him. She was small, her clothes worn thin from travel, her satchel little more than an old scrap of cloth tied with rope. Her hands trembled in her lap, and her eyes, deep and dark, looked both lost and scared. The station master, an impatient man with little sympathy for strangers, shook his head. "Been sitting there 2 hours now, Sheriff. Nobody come for her. Ticket's long gone, says she ain't got money for another. I can't keep her here all night, not with the trains done for the day." Daniel took a slow breath, studying the girl. She didn't speak, not even when he stepped closer. Rain ran down her face, though she didn't bother to brush it away. She looked like someone who had been waiting for rescue her whole life and finally realized no one was coming. "Miss," Daniel said gently, his voice calm, the way he might soothe a frightened horse. "Do you have someone you're meeting here? Family, maybe?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She gave the smallest shake of her head. The station master crossed his arms. "See, won't talk. I say she's trouble. Folks pass through, they bring nothing but problems." Daniel ignored him. He crouched a little so his eyes were level with hers. "What's your name?" he asked. After a long pause, she whispered, "Clara." The name was soft, almost fragile, like she was afraid it would be taken from her if she said it too loud. Daniel nodded, repeating it once, gently, as if to anchor it in the room. "Clara, all right." Behind him, the wind howled against the walls of the station, rattling the windows. The night was too cold for anyone to be left outside, especially someone as thin and tired as this girl. Daniel knew he should send her to the boarding house down the street, but he also knew how the keeper there treated those without money, like they were less than human. And he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "Sheriff," the station master said sharply, "I ain't running a shelter. She's your problem now." Daniel stood, pulling his coat tighter. He offered Clara his hand. She looked at it with hesitation, then slowly placed her small hand in his. Her skin was cold, almost icy, and he could feel how she trembled. Without another word, he guided her out of the station and into the storm. The walk back to the sheriff's quarters was short, but the rain made it feel longer. The town was quiet. The lamps in the saloon dimmed, the horses tied under awnings for shelter. As they walked, Daniel caught the curious eyes of a few townsfolk peering out windows, their silhouettes marked by lamplight. He knew what they'd say tomorrow, that the sheriff had brought home a stranger, a girl with no past, no ties, no proof of who she was. Gossip traveled faster than the trains here. When they reached the small house behind the jail, Daniel opened the door and let her step inside. The warmth of the fireplace still lingered from earlier in the evening, though the flames had died down to glowing embers. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, just as it had been for the past 2 years since his wife had passed. For a long moment, Daniel stood in the doorway, watching the girl take cautious steps inside as if she feared she wasn't allowed. "You'll catch your death sitting in wet clothes," Daniel said softly. He fetched a blanket from the chair and handed it to her. She clutched it tightly, pulling it around her shoulders. For the first time, he saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. There was a small room at the back of the house that had sat empty for months. His late wife had once filled it with sunlight and flowers, but now it was bare, only a bed and a dresser left behind. Daniel hadn't opened the door in weeks, unable to face the silence inside. Yet tonight, as he set the lantern on the dresser and pulled back the quilt, he realized that leaving the room closed had been a way of keeping his life locked in grief. "You can stay here tonight," he told her. "It ain't much, but it's warm and dry." Clara stood in the doorway, her blanket still tight around her. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. In the end, she just nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Daniel gave her space, leaving the lantern on and closing the door halfway so she wouldn't feel trapped. He returned to the front room and sat heavily in his chair, staring at the fire. His mind wandered back to his wife, to the way she used to open their door to anyone in need, a drifter, a hungry child, even a wounded stranger. She had believed in kindness more than anyone he had ever known. Daniel realized that tonight, by bringing Clara home, he had done something she would have wanted. As the rain continued to fall outside, Daniel found himself listening for the sound of movement in the back room. There was something about the girl's presence that made the house feel different, not quite full but not as empty as before. It was too soon to understand what it meant, but in that moment he knew one thing for certain. She was no longer sitting alone at a station bench with no one to claim her. For tonight at least she had a roof over her head and someone willing to keep watch. And Daniel, though he would not admit it aloud, felt a quiet shift inside his heart. Morning came slowly in Willow Creek. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still muddy and mist hung low over the roofs of the little town. The sheriff's house, though simple, looked warmer than it had in years. Daniel Harlow, weary but steady as always, rose early, brewed his coffee, and stepped outside to see the quiet dawn. He could hear the faint sound of a door creaking in the back room. The girl he had taken in was awake. When Daniel returned inside, Clara stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked nervous, as if she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to step forward. She still wore the worn dress from the night before, though now it was dry. Her blanket was folded neatly over her arm, and her hair, dark and tangled, fell around her shoulders. "You can sit," Daniel said, gesturing to the chair at the table. His tone was kind but firm, the voice of a man who didn't like wasted words. Clara hesitated, then quietly took the seat. She folded her hands on the table, her eyes lowered. "I'll get you something to eat," Daniel added. He placed bread and a slice of cheese before her, along with a small tin of jam. She touched the food carefully, as though it might vanish if she wasn't gentle. Then slowly she ate. For the first time since he had found her at the station, color returned to her cheeks. Neither spoke much during breakfast, but Daniel kept glancing at her, studying her in silence. Something in the way she avoided his eyes told him she had known too much judgment in her life already. By the time Clara finished eating, the town was stirring awake. Outside, the sound of wagon wheels splashing through puddles reached their ears, along with the calls of merchants setting up their goods. Daniel knew it wouldn't be long before people noticed the girl wasn't at the station anymore. And once they realized she was under his roof, tongues would start wagging. He wasn't wrong. By mid-morning, when Daniel walked to the jailhouse to check on a few reports, the townsfolk were already buzzing. Mrs. Crane, who ran the bakery, cornered him near the boardwalk. Her arms were dusted with flour, her apron already busy with work, but her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Sheriff Harlow," she said, lowering her voice, "I hear you've brought someone into your home. A girl, no less. Alone with no family?" Daniel didn't flinch. "That's right. She needed a roof." Mrs. Crane pursed her lips. "You don't know where she came from. Folks don't just appear at stations without reason. Mark my words, she'll bring you nothing but trouble." Daniel tipped his hat politely, but his jaw tightened. He didn't reply to gossip. He had spent his years keeping order in Willow Creek, and he knew better than to fuel the fire. At the saloon, whispers were louder. Men leaned against the bar, trading stories about the mysterious stranger the sheriff had brought home. Some said she was a thief. Others claimed she was tied to a wandering gang. A few laughed, saying maybe the widowed sheriff was lonely and had found himself company. Daniel heard all of it without a word, his silence sharper than any denial he could offer. Back at the house, Clara tried to make herself useful. She swept the porch with a broom she found leaning by the door. She fetched water from the pump and fed the sheriff's chickens. Every task she did quietly, as though afraid she might be scolded if she did too much. When Daniel returned at midday, he saw her sitting on the steps, wiping her hands on her dress. She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of displeasure. "You don't have to do all that," Daniel said, setting down his satchel. "I wanted to," Clara whispered. Her voice was soft but clear enough for him to hear. He nodded, not pushing her further. As the day stretched on, Daniel noticed how different the house felt. It had been silent for so long, its emptiness a constant reminder of his wife's absence. But now the sight of Clara moving about, quietly but with purpose, softened the sharp edges of his grief. She didn't speak much, but her presence was enough to remind him that life could still bring unexpected turns. Yet outside the house, Judgment brewed stronger. At church the next evening, Daniel overheard more chatter. Some claimed Clara must have been left at the station for a reason, that she was unwanted or worse, dangerous. A few even suggested Daniel was risking his reputation as sheriff by keeping her under his roof. Reverend Miles, a kind but cautious man, approached Daniel after the service. "She is young and people talk, Sheriff," the Reverend said. "Are you certain this is wise? Folks trust you to uphold order." Daniel met his gaze steadily. "I'm doing what I believe is right. If that ruffles feathers, so be it." Still, Daniel couldn't ignore the storm building among his neighbors. Clara, too, seemed to sense it. She kept to the house more, venturing outside only when necessary. She avoided the marketplace, avoided the glances of strangers. Each time Daniel left for his duties, he saw her watching from the window, her face caught between gratitude and fear, as if she expected him not to return. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with gold and purple, Daniel found Clara sitting by the fire, mending one of his old shirts with thread she had found in a drawer. Her small hands worked carefully, stitching each tear with patience. "Where'd you learn that?" Daniel asked, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "My mother taught me," Clara replied softly. Before she was gone, the words hung heavy in the room. Daniel didn't press her, though his heart ached at the sorrow in her tone. He simply nodded and let the silence rest between them. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the whispers in town became louder. Some accused the sheriff of taking pity where none was due. Others suggested Clara should be sent away before real trouble followed her. But Daniel had seen enough of her to know otherwise. He saw how she tended the garden with care, how she left small flowers in a jar on the windowsill, how she spoke kindly to his old horse when she thought no one was listening. Each small act was proof to him that Clara wasn't a burden. She was a soul searching for a place to belong. One afternoon, a peddler passing through town stopped at Daniel's house. He looked Clara over with a sharp eye and muttered something about seeing her face before. The comment unsettled Daniel, though the peddler left without explaining further. That night, Clara seemed restless. She paced the small room, her eyes filled with shadows. "Clara," Daniel said gently, "you've nothing to fear here, not while you're under my roof." She stopped, her eyes meeting his for the first time with full honesty. "But I don't belong here. I never belong anywhere." Daniel's chest tightened at her words. He thought of the loneliness that had lived in his own heart since his wife's passing, and how Clara's arrival had stirred something he thought was long gone. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "belonging ain't about where you come from. It's about who's willing to stand by you." Clara's lips trembled, and though she said nothing, the tears in her eyes told him she understood. For all the town's whispers, Daniel knew the truth that night. This girl was not trouble, not shame, not burden. She was a test of kindness in a world too quick to turn its back. And as long as he wore the badge on his chest, he would not fail it. The days in Willow Creek settled into a rhythm. Clara grew more comfortable in the sheriff's house, though she still moved with quiet steps as though afraid she might disturb something that didn't belong to her. She swept floors, tended the small garden, and sometimes hummed softly when she thought Daniel wasn't listening. Her voice was light and sweet, carrying a tune that reminded him of his late wife's gentle singing. Still, beneath the calm surface, shadows lingered. Clara never spoke much of her past. She offered no last name, no details about family or where she had come from. The townsfolk noticed, and their whispers grew heavier with each passing week. Daniel could feel the weight of their suspicion pressing against his role as sheriff. He had lived by duty all his life, but for the first time, duty and compassion were at war in his heart. One evening, after finishing his patrol around town, Daniel returned home to find Clara sitting on the porch steps. The lantern beside her glowed faintly, casting a soft light on her face. She seemed lost in thought, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You're sitting out late," Daniel said. Stepping up the porch, Clara lifted her eyes, and for a moment he saw a storm of emotions behind them. Fear, sorrow, and something close to shame. She looked as if she had been holding words inside her for too long. "I need to tell you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "about where I came from." Daniel sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't push her, but his steady presence invited her to continue. Clara drew in a shaky breath. "I wasn't wanted where I lived. My mother, she was kind, but she passed when I was young. After that, My stepfather treated me like I was just another pair of hands to work the fields. To him, I wasn't a daughter. I was a burden. She paused, her eyes watering. He never spoke to me with kindness. He never saw me as family. I was given chores from sunrise to sunset, and if I slowed down, I was scolded. If I spoke, I was silenced. And when I asked if I might go to school or learn letters, he laughed at me, said it was a waste. Daniel clenched his jaw, anger simmering quietly in his chest. He didn't interrupt. So I left, Clara said softly, her fingers twisting in her lap. One night, when no one was looking, I packed the little I had and walked until my feet blistered. I thought maybe if I reached the train line, someone might help me. I bought the cheapest ticket I could, but when I got off at Willow Creek, there was no one waiting. I didn't even know where I meant to go next. That's when you found me. The silence after her words was heavy. Daniel took a slow breath, weighing everything she had said. He could see the truth in her eyes, the raw pain of a girl who had lived unloved for too long. You were brave, he finally said. Braver than most grown men I know. Leaving all that behind, even with nothing certain ahead. It takes courage. Clara shook her head, a tear sliding down her cheek. It didn't feel brave. It felt like I had nowhere else to go. Daniel looked at her with steady eyes. Sometimes that's how courage starts. For the first time since arriving, Clara's shoulders seemed to ease. It wasn't a smile she gave him. Not fully, but the faintest spark of relief touched her expression. The following days, Clara began to open more, little by little. She spoke of the books her mother once read to her before she passed and how she dreamed of learning to read on her own. She spoke of how, when she was younger, she had wished for nothing more than a place where she could belong, where she could be seen as something more than a burden. Daniel listened, and each story chipped away at the wall he had built around his own heart. Since losing his wife, he had closed himself to feeling, to caring too deeply. But Clara's words stirred something in him he thought was gone, a desire to protect, to guide, and perhaps to heal not just her, but himself. Still, the town did not see what he saw. The whispers grew sharper. At the Mercantile, Daniel overheard two men muttering that Clara was surely hiding something darker. At the blacksmith's forge, someone suggested she might have stolen from her family, which was why no one had come searching. The talk was cruel, baseless, but Daniel knew how such words could harden into judgment. One afternoon, a stranger rode into town, a traveling marshal who often passed through Willow Creek to deliver news and check on warrants. He was a tall man with a stern face, his coat dusty from the trail. Over coffee at the jailhouse, the marshal asked Daniel if he had seen a missing girl described in a circular. A runaway, last seen weeks ago in a neighboring county. Daniel's heart tightened, though the description was vague. Dark hair, slender build, young in age. It could have been many girls, but it also could have been Clara. The marshal's sharp eyes noticed Daniel's hesitation. You know something, Sheriff? Daniel shook his head slowly. Not sure. Plenty of strangers pass through. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. He couldn't bring himself to hand Clara over, not when she had just begun to feel safe. That night he returned home to find Clara sitting at the table, her hands folded nervously. She could sense something was wrong. What happened? She asked quietly. Daniel studied her for a long moment before answering. A marshal's looking for a runaway girl. Don't know if it's you, but if it is, you don't have to be afraid. You're not in trouble here. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I'm not a criminal, Sheriff. I only ran from a place that never wanted me. I couldn't stay there, not one more day. Daniel's voice softened. I know, and you're safe here. That's what matters. For the first time, Clara broke down fully, her quiet sobs filling the room. Daniel didn't move to touch her, but he stayed near, letting her grief spill without judgment. In that moment, he realized something deeper. This girl wasn't just a stranger in need of a roof. She was someone who needed someone to stand for her, someone to believe her story when no one else would. And though the weight of the town's suspicion pressed hard, Daniel knew where his duty lay. He would protect her, even if it meant standing against the very people he had sworn to keep safe. The days following the marshal's visit were heavy with tension. Clara stayed mostly inside, though she still tried to keep busy, sweeping, mending clothes, or reading scraps of old newspapers Daniel left on the table, tracing her fingers over the words as though willing them to come alive. But even as she carried on with small tasks, Daniel could see the fear that lingered in her eyes. The town's whispers had not lessened. In fact, they had grown louder. When Daniel walked down Main Street, he heard fragments of conversation carried on the breeze. The sheriff's girl, troublemaker, don't belong here. Some accused Clara of being dishonest. Others speculated she was hiding from the law. None of them had taken the time to look past the gossip, but their judgment was sharp enough to cut through the quiet peace Daniel had tried to build at home. It all came to a head one afternoon at the general store. Daniel had gone to pick up supplies and Clara had followed him, insisting she wanted to help carry things. The moment she stepped inside, the store fell silent. Conversations halted and every eye turned toward her. Mrs. Crane, the baker's wife who had always been the loudest critic, folded her arms and raised her voice. "Sheriff, it's one thing to shelter a stranger in your house, but bringing her here among decent folk? That girl's got no family, no past. You don't even know who she is. For all we know, she's running from some crime." Clara froze, her face pale. She wanted to retreat, but Daniel placed a firm hand on her shoulder. His voice was calm, but it carried the strength of a man who would not be moved. "She is under my roof," he said, "and while she is under my protection. If anyone's got an issue with that, they'll bring it to me." A tense silence followed. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared challenge him further. Daniel collected his supplies, guided Clara out, and didn't say a word until they were back home. Clara set the bags down on the table, her hands trembling. "You shouldn't have defended me like that," she whispered. "Now they'll only turn more against you." Daniel looked at her with steady eyes. "I don't care what they say. What matters is the truth. And I know you're no criminal. I've seen your heart. That's enough." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she turned away, ashamed of letting him see her cry. For so long she had been treated as a burden. To hear someone stand for her, it was both a relief and a weight she didn't know how to carry. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel's daughter, Emily, returned home from staying with her aunt for a few days. Emily was only 8 years old, bright-eyed and curious, with the same gentle spirit her late mother had carried. When she first saw Clara in the house, she tilted her head and asked innocently, "Who's she, Pa?" Daniel hesitated, unsure how to explain. But Clara knelt down, meeting Emily's gaze with a soft smile. "I'm Clara," she said gently. "Your father was kind enough to let me stay." Emily studied her for a moment, then smiled and offered her a small doll. "You can sit by me at supper," she said. Just like that, the child's acceptance filled the room with warmth that no amount of gossip could steal. From that day on, Clara and Emily grew close. Clara mended Emily's torn dresses, braided her hair, and told her little stories in the evenings. Stories her mother had once told her before her life had turned so cold. Emily's laughter returned to the house, ringing like bells through the halls that had once been silent. And Daniel, though quiet, noticed how the house felt alive again. How Clara's presence was no longer that of a stranger, but of someone who belonged. But the town wasn't ready to forgive or forget. A week later, the marshal returned, his horse kicking up dust as he rode down the main street. He stopped at the sheriff's office with a circular in hand. "Sheriff Harlow," he said, his tone sharp. "I've confirmed the missing girl's description. She matches the one you've got under your roof. The family wants her returned." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That family," he asked carefully, "is it her stepfather?" The marshal nodded. "Man claims she ran away without cause. Wants her back on the farm." Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the circular. The law was clear. If someone was claimed as missing and a guardian demanded them back, he was expected to comply. But as he thought of Clara's trembling voice, her stories of cruelty, and the way Emily's laughter had returned because of her, he felt the weight of a choice pressing against his chest. That night, Daniel told Clara what the marshal had said. She sat at the table, her face pale, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. "If he takes me back," she whispered, "I'll never get free again. He'll keep me there until I'm nothing." Daniel's heart ached. He saw the fear in her eyes, the kind that came from years of being silenced and dismissed. He knew what the law demanded, but he also knew what justice truly was. "You're not alone anymore, Clara," Daniel said firmly. "If the law tries to send you back to a place that breaks you, then it ain't justice. And I won't let it happen." The following morning, Daniel met the marshal in the center of town. A small crowd had gathered, curious about the outcome. The marshal demanded Clara be handed over. But Daniel, standing tall with his badge gleaming in the sun, refused. "This girl has no charges against her," he said loud enough for the crowd to hear. "She's broken no law. She's harmed no one. If the only crime she's guilty of is wanton freedom from cruelty, then I'll stand by her side. She stays in Willow Creek as long as she wishes." Gasps rippled through the townsfolk. Some murmured disapproval, but others, those who had once known what it was to be powerless, nodded in quiet agreement. The marshal, though frustrated, knew better than to challenge the town's own sheriff without cause. He left with a glare, muttering that the matter wasn't over. When the crowd dispersed, Clara stood quietly by the edge of the street, tears glistening in her eyes. She had watched it all, and for the first time, she believed that someone truly saw her worth. That evening, as they sat down to supper, Emily chattered happily, Clara smiled softly, and Daniel found himself looking at the two of them across the table. His house, once filled only with silence and grief, now glowed with a warmth he had thought was gone forever. The sheriff had made his choice. And though the road ahead would not be easy, he knew in his heart it was the right one. Clara was no longer a burden to be passed from one set of hands to another. She was part of something now, part of a family that was slowly being pieced back together, one act of kindness at a time. The days after the marshal's departure were filled with an uneasy calm. Though he had left Willow Creek without taking Clara, his words echoed like thunder in the minds of the townsfolk. Some people looked at Clara with new suspicion, whispering that trouble might return with the law. Others, however, began to soften, remembering how Daniel had stood tall in the center of town, defending a girl who had no one else. Clara herself felt torn. Though Daniel's protection gave her comfort, a part of her feared that at any moment she could be dragged back to the life she had escaped. Every knock at the door made her heart race. Every rider passing on the road filled her with dread. Yet slowly, with each sunrise, those fears grew lighter as she realized Daniel's words had not been spoken just for show. He truly meant them. Inside the sheriff's home, a new life was quietly forming. Emily clung to Clara as though she had always been there. They shared laughter over small things, burning a loaf of bread in the oven, dropping a basket of apples, or racing to see who could finish chores first. At night, Clara told Emily bedtime stories, weaving tales from her childhood memories. The child's giggles filled the house, and Daniel, sitting in his chair by the fire, would close his eyes and listen. He hadn't realized how much he missed the sound of joy until it returned. One evening, as the air turned crisp and the leaves on the few town trees began to change, Daniel walked onto the porch to find Clara sitting with Emily. The little girl had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder, her doll clutched in her hand. Clara looked up at him, her expression caught somewhere between peace and uncertainty. "She feels like family," Clara whispered, stroking Emily's hair. Daniel's voice was low and steady. "That's because you are." The words struck Clara's heart with a force she hadn't expected. For so long she had been unwanted, unseen, treated as nothing more than labor. To hear those words, spoken with conviction by a man who owed her nothing, felt like a door opening inside her soul. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't from sorrow. They were from something she had never truly felt before: belonging. Still, the world outside their little home did not quiet easily. A letter arrived weeks later, carried by a rider demanding that Clara be returned to her stepfather. It was signed and sealed by local authorities from another county. The law was clear, but justice was not. Daniel read the letter in silence, then folded it and set it on the table. Clara's hands shook when she saw it. "Are they coming for me?" she asked in a trembling voice. Daniel looked at her with calm strength. "If they do, they'll have to go through me first." Her eyes widened, searching his face. "But you'd be risking everything. Your name, your duty." "My duty," he interrupted gently, "is to protect the innocent. And Clara, that's you. You deserve more than chains disguised as family ties. You deserve a life." For the first time in her life, Clara believed those words. The weeks passed, and the threat of being taken away slowly faded. The marshal never returned, and no men arrived to drag her back. The townsfolk, who had once whispered against her, began to see her differently. They noticed her kindness when she helped the elderly carry baskets at the market. They saw her gentleness with Emily and her quiet respect for the town's way of life. Slowly, the sharp edge of gossip dulled into silence. Mrs. Crane, who had once been her harshest critic, even came to the sheriff's house one morning with a loaf of fresh bread. She didn't apologize outright, but the gesture said what words could not. Clara accepted it with a soft smile, and something shifted in the town's heart that day. By winter, the sheriff's home was no longer a place of grief and silence. It was alive. Clara sewed curtains for the windows, baked bread with Emily, and planted flowers in pots by the door. Daniel, who had once sat alone at the table with nothing but memories, now found himself surrounded by warmth and laughter. Each evening, when he hung his hat and badge by the door, he knew he was not returning to an empty house. He was coming home. One night, after Emily had gone to bed and the fire burned low, Daniel sat across from Clara at the table. He watched her quietly as she mended one of Emily's dresses, her hand steady, her face lit softly by the glow of the lamp. "You know," he said slowly, "when I first brought you from that station, I thought it was just for one night. A roof, a warm bed, and then I'd find some way to see you off." Clara looked up, her eyes curious but calm. "But I was wrong," Daniel continued. "What started as one night turned into something I didn't expect. You've brought life back into this house, Clara. You've given Emily laughter again, and you've given me a reason to hope." Clara's lips parted, her heart pounding. She had never expected words like that, not from anyone, least of all from a man as steady and guarded as Daniel. "You don't owe me anything, Sheriff," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel shook his head. "This isn't about owing. It's about belonging. You don't have to run anymore. You don't have to be afraid. If you'll stay, Clara, this can be your home." The room was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but this time she did not look away. She nodded slowly but firmly, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'll stay." And in that moment, the weight of her past seemed to lift. The girl who had once sat abandoned on a station bench with no one to claim her had finally found a place, a family, and a reason to remain. The winter snow fell over Willow Creek, blanketing the town in silence. Inside the sheriff's house, warmth glowed from the windows. Emily's laughter filled the rooms. Clara's gentle hands made the house a home, and Daniel's steady presence stood as a shield against the world. No longer was Clara the unwanted stranger. She was part of a story of healing, her own and Daniel's. Together, they had built something that gossip could not break, that loneliness could not steal, and that no law could undo. For the first time in her life, Clara had more than just a place to stay. She had a family, a purpose, and a reason to stay. And for Daniel, the widowed sheriff who thought his heart had been buried with his wife, Clara was proof that even in the quietest towns, under the heaviest burdens, hope could be found again.